Welcome everybody who's joining us for our final webinar today, webinar 4 for Reading Above the Fray by leaning into the essential instructional practices in early literacy and the broadcast series Read, Write, Roar. We are thrilled to have you with us today. Again, if you want to see closed captions at the bottom, just press that little button and everything will show up for you. The chat is disabled, but you can put questions into the Q&A, and I still have some of that Q&A that I need to upload into the Padlet, but we will get that done for you. And Liberty is kindly putting different links in the chat for you as you are joining us. You're going to get the note taker guide that you can make a copy of, the learner guide, and my slide deck, which has a lot of links in it. So have that prepared for you today. So here's what we're doing in webinar 4. You probably feel very used to this, that we're learning about the what, why, and how of foundational skills and what research-supported instruction can look like, in particular related to Dr. Lindsey's book. And we're also making a lot of connections to Essentials 4 and 5. And today we're going to be thinking more about 6. We are connecting these to the Read, Write, Roar series to help you just see one way that you might have some support for applying some of the things that we've learned beyond all the wonderful resources that Dr. Lindsey is sharing with us. And we do want to give you time to reflect upon your learning. So speaking about that, you'll notice that in the note-taking guide that we have for you today, there is a question in there that asks where you are for goal setting. And so we'll be having you think about this throughout the webinar about where you are in this work. And Dr. Lindsey is going to give us some great guidance depending on if you haven't started anything, if you have started to apply, or if you've been applying this work, what a next step for you might be. And your learner guide is linked in for you in what Liberty's putting into the chat for you. And there are 2 pages again. And because it's our last webinar, instead of a preparing for the next webinar, we have some thoughts about preparing for the, oh, that's an error. It's supposed to be 2023-2024 school year. So I'll fix that in the updated version of your learner guide and get that to you. Last time we talked about, excuse me, our literacy theory of action. And so I just want to say, thank you to all of you who have been coming to this. You are so busy in your classrooms, and the amount of time that you're dedicating to do this work, to be doing the reading, to be coming here. Some of you are rewatching these again, even if you've come. And do want to let you know that Dr. Lindsey and I chatted earlier, and we are going to have these videos available for you to watch through June 30th. So up until that date, many of you were asking if you could rewatch it. So those will be available for you to rewatch. And as you continue to think in this space about where you are on this literacy theory of action, do consider who else you need to be talking with so we can work together as a team to create a cohesive and consistent instruction for all the children that we are serving in Michigan through literacy. And again, in my slide deck, you'll see the link to that. We are, again, always grounded in the essential instructional practices, and we did so much learning around Essential 4 and applying that in the last 2 webinars with segmenting and blending. We also talked about high frequency words in our last webinar and did some work around that, and that's also in the chapter that Dr. Lindsey is talking about today. So that's on pages 113 and 114, where she also gives you some additional tips for high frequency words. And again, we've been talking about being verbally precise and involving multiple channels when we're teaching children about letter-sound relationships and how critical it is that we are knowledgeable what our state standards are as we're doing that. So we hope that you will keep those things in mind as you are learning today. And then let's think about today. Last time we talked a little bit about letter formation, and this time we're going to really be thinking about some spelling strategies and bringing together Essentials 4, 5, and 6, honing in on the ways that decoding and encoding are related, and focusing on opportunities to decode and encode in context. So without further ado, I'm going to pass this over to Dr. Lindsey, who's going to get started with all of her great information for us and stop sharing.
Sorry about that. I had myself muted. So wonderful to be back with all of you for our last webinar. I am sort of sad that we're coming to a close, but hopefully you've got lots of good information out of our time together, and we'll continue to be able to build your practice from here. So in this final webinar, we are going to talk about applying these foundations to real reading and writing contexts knowing that we need to build readers and writers, not just foundations machines. And so we are going to be thinking about how we can ensure some transfer into reading and writing. So in this session, we're going to talk about decodable texts and what the research is around that. And I bolded that because we're going to talk about that a little bit more than these other topics. Then we're going to talk a bit about spelling, in particular, thinking about spelling in kids' writing. And we're going to talk a little bit about independent reading. And then at the end, we'll just briefly talk about what we've learned, where we're going, and hopefully give you some ideas for what you can start doing next. So recall that we talked last time, and I think actually probably every time, we've talked about this idea about teaching decoding on purpose and thinking about how we can support children in really being able to learn how to decode words by bringing the same level of explicitness and precision to teaching kids to decode that we bring to teaching them individual sound spelling relationships or anything else in our day. And so we talked about how in order to do this, we first need to make sure we're teaching all of the elements of decoding systematically and explicitly. That's things like phonemic awareness from our second webinar and sound spelling relationships from last time, as well as for those children that need it, especially in kindergarten or kids who are newer to our country or our writing system, some print concepts and vocabulary as well. Then we talked about how we need to teach children the act of decoding and encoding explicitly and systematically, instead of imagining that children will spontaneously bring all of these skills to bear at the moment that they need to use them to read or spell a word, giving them some knowledge, some steps, some explicitness around how we do that through modeling, again, through giving kids steps about how you actually decode a word, for reminding them that they're bringing that knowledge to bear, and the like. And then we talked at length last time in particular around how we can need to provide a lot of out of context practice with kids primarily reading and spelling words or decoding and encoding in that phonics time of day, making sure it's loud and making sure that we have a heavy focus on student practice. And finally, the last element of teaching decoding on purpose is supporting tons and tons of application of decoding and encoding in context. Finally, kind of completing that transfer of knowledge from all the way from that tiny level of being able to hear a phoneme to actually being able to use this information to read a new book or to write a new text or any other purpose that a child has where they can bring these particular skills to bear. We've also talked a bit about what it means to have effective foundational skills instructions and what are my tenets of effective foundational skills instruction. And these are right out of the book, and I talk about them in every chapter related to that particular topic. And now we've made it to the last one. Here we are, and we're really going to talk about how are we integrating all of these ideas with and applying them to real reading and writing. We can't stop at the level of kids just seeing things in isolation. We do need to be sensitive to the fact that we need to move them carefully into the space of applying these skills in actual text. Now, in this cycle of trying to get kids towards application, I think about 3 elements that we're really doing to teach these elements of decoding. First, we're starting with that explicit instruction, which we've discussed needs to be precise and concise, making sure that kids know exactly what they need to know and not too much extra fluff. This is often best done in the whole class experience because all children need access to this information. Everybody can benefit from knowing the digraph CH spells the sound ch. So having everybody in that experience is normally the easiest and best way to do this. And that is indeed for grade level content. Obviously, if we are dealing with an intervention setting, that's probably going to be a smaller group. The second element of teaching decoding is practice. It's that idea that we are doing direct practice out of context. So we are doing a word building. We are doing a word sort where we are ensuring kids are actually reading and spelling while they're sorting. We are doing a dictation of an individual word or maybe a very short sentence. We are doing a lot of acts that are primarily focused on decoding and encoding and not necessarily focused on additional elements of reading like vocabulary or making meaning. Practice like this is most often easiest to do, again, in that whole class environment because we can have everybody with us and we are following, say, our phonics curriculum. And we are doing a lot of rapid at-bats for all children to get access to tons and tons of practice with a particular skill. We might also do it in a small group, or we might even do it in a supported independent space, like with kids working on an iPad that's supporting them in some sort of game around phonics, or with kids doing a sort with a peer where they are having to read the word to their peer in order to actually do that sort. And then finally, we arrive at this idea of application, bringing these skills to bear on reading and writing tasks. This is likely going to be easiest in small groups or independent and or one-on-one. That's because we know that kids are going to need a lot of support in certain moments in order to be able to bring all of these skills into that situation. We also know that it's pretty hard, if not impossible, to listen to 30 first graders reading a book all simultaneously. So the size of the group helps us be more precise in supporting an individual child's needs. So when we're talking today about these types of application, we will be talking about things that are probably easiest to do if kids are in a smaller group or if you're with a child one-on-one. But that doesn't mean that you can't do these in a whole class environment, or you can't use strategic placement of your own body by being with one kid, but directing the whole class to do a particular task. So just keep that in mind that this is a context agnostic decision. We're talking about the purpose that you might have for instruction and the right kinds of moves to do to get kids to that goal. And that may or may not be dependent on the context that you're in and the group size. But we're really going to be focusing on the moves and the materials at larger scale. So today we're really talking a lot about what happens in chapter 8, but we're actually going to go beyond some of the content in chapter 8 a bit with some of our discussion on spelling. In chapter 8, it's going to teach you all about why we're talking about decoding on purpose, what I really mean by that, and how we can give kids enough chances to practice and apply decoding. And so the key takeaway in this chapter is really that this isn't just phonics. This does require us to put on a new lens, and it might not feel totally different to us depending on what we've been doing in the past, or it might feel like a tweak, like a positional move instead of taking many, many steps. And that's okay, but acknowledging that we do need to bring something different in order to accomplish this. This chapter also has a little bit of information about how to assess decoding. There's an example of one way that you can listen to children's reading. There's also a lot of information about how you might be trying to understand children's decoding and encoding through different types of assessments. If you are looking for that reading inventory focused on decoding that's in the book, there is a blank version of that on the resource page for the book, which is on the very back inside cover of the book. It will take you to that website, and then there is you will need to put in a password that is in the book as well. I was told by a number of people that the link was broken last week to get into that website, and many of those folks are people in this webinar. But Scholastic has since fixed that. So it should be working now if you want to take a look at that. All right, so now let's go ahead and get into our 3 topics of the day, starting with decodable texts. All right, and we're going to start with a poll. Our first poll is, how often do you use decodable texts? Give it an estimate. Never, about once a week, 3 or more times a week, or every single day. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and end the poll. All right, so we have some folks saying they never use it, and then a lot of folks saying about once a week, 3+ or more, or every day, with the majority of people saying, in that medium range, about 3 times a week. So we have a lot of people who have used decodables quite a lot, which is exciting to see. And I do want you to go ahead and make sure that you're getting your questions about these texts answered. So as you have questions that come up about decodables, please go ahead and put them in the Q&A, because we're going to start at a high level of just understanding what these texts are. And then I will offer some additional things to think about as you are continuing to use these texts. If you haven't used them before, I want to offer you just a very simple reason why. Why should we use decodable texts? Well, if we want kids to practice decoding in context, if we want them to apply decoding to books, we got to give them books with words they can actually decode. We can't expect kids to be able to decode a word like alligator when the only thing we've taught them is basic letter sound relationships from the alphabet. So it's a little unfair to give them books that have tons and tons of words like that and then expect them to be able to read that using the information we've taught them. Essentially, what we're doing if we do that is kind of crossing our fingers and hoping kids have learned those words in other spaces. Instead, when we give them books with a high proportion of words that they can actually decode, they are able to use the knowledge that we have taught them in those texts to be successful. So what does the research really say about these texts? Well, the research shows us that decodable texts allow developing decoders to be successful in text. We see in the research 3 things that I think you're going to think are very important. First, we see that children use phonics more in decodable text than other types of text. Second, we see that decodable texts allow children to be more accurate at recognizing words. And third, we see that in decodable text, children are less reliant on the teacher and more able to use their own knowledge to recognize words. Now, without even talking about the impact of decodable text on kids' reading, I think that those 3 things are essential things to know. I can't think of anything that would make me happier as a kindergarten teacher than if my students were looking at my face less and looking at the text more and being more accurate as they read. So in this way, we can think of decodables as a type of home run for us as we're trying to get our children to be more independent as readers and to actually bring their own skills to bear. When a child comes up to a word that they can decode, they still might need your help. They still might need some prompting and support, but they do bring their own knowledge and skills instead of needing to rely on a picture or the context of a sentence or on you just giving them the answer. We also see that decodable texts are likely to help children in getting greater reading proficiency than reading other texts. However, the research on decodable texts is not as impressive as the research on some of the other areas of reading. That's because we just simply don't have that many studies. We have many, many more studies, for example, on the need for explicit systematic phonics. And we have far fewer studies that have really investigated decodable texts. We have even less, and if any, actually, I would say we probably have no studies at all that are comparing this type of decodable to that type of decodable. So we have studies that compare decodable text to basal readers, decodable text to level text reading, decodable text to anything else that might be happening in a classroom that isn't well described, but we don't necessarily have this kind of decodable compared to this kind of decodable. Now, what that means is that we don't actually have a ton of precise information about what the features of decodable text should be. And at present, we do not have a research-based answer to the question of how decodable. When we think about how decodable, what we're really asking is, how many words in this text should be decodable for it to be as supportive as possible of a child's reading development and of their fluency and accuracy in this particular text? Again, at present, we do not have an answer. Based on the research that we do have, we can estimate that texts need to be over 70% decodable to be able to actually bring a benefit. However, based on conversations that I've had over the years with teachers, I often hear kindergarten teachers in particular saying that they see a great benefit to text being at least 90% decodable. So we see that we have a range of things that are available to us and a range of things that are able to be implemented, and that is okay, as long as we understand that we might not need to always be getting that 100% decodable text in order to call it a decodable, but also can't just grab something that is 50% decodable and say, oh, this is going to bring the same benefit to the children in front of us. So do watch out. Things that are labeled decodables are not always decodables. There has actually been some research on this that is fairly depressing that finds that if you look at all the decodables that people have published and you actually looked across them and saw how many are actually decodable based on a scope and sequence, a really low percentage ends up actually having a high proportion of decodable words. So you got to do a little due diligence, look at every single text in front of you and try to figure out if it is going to fit the needs of your children. Now, decodable texts are ultimately going to be a function of the reader. They're the ultimate tool for differentiation. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, we can take a look at something like this. A text that's labeled decodable does not necessarily work the same for everyone. If you look at a book like this, Rick and the Doc, which is available on Beyond Decodables, my website, and was developed in conjunction with the Boston Public Schools, we see that for the child who is exactly where they should be at the scope and sequence in that phonics class, it's about 96% decodable. That means that 96% of the words in that book contain only sound spelling relationships that child has learned or are a high frequency word that the child has already been taught. But if you're a child in that same class and you are not yet reading words with those consonant digraphs, which is the target phonics pattern in this book, and you're really still working on CVC words, this book is only 59% decodable. It's far, far harder for you to access the words in this text if you're not ready for that step. And if you look at an adult reader, obviously this text is going to be 100% decodable because I could read every single word in the text. In other words, decodability is a scale. It is dependent on the reader. What we need to do, though, in order to actually be able to teach, is that we often are going to want to match our decodable text to our phonics scope and sequence. That's because we have to expect that children are going to learn and or need to practice what we have taught them in phonics. So if you've never used decodable text before or you're using them infrequently, your first step should be to make sure that you are getting decodable texts that are matched to your scope and sequence in phonics so that kids can take the content that they've learned in phonics and directly apply it in a decodable text. But if you have started really using them a lot and you feel really confident, you can also start thinking about how you might additionally layer on a level of thinking about, for those children who do need differentiated support, are there other texts we can also work with to support them in some of these earlier decoding skills as well? All right, so now we're just going to quickly take a look at two texts, and I want you to think about which one is going to be a decodable text for this particular reader and which one is not. All right, I'm a first grader who can read CVC words. I'm working on reading words with digraphs. Which one should I read, text A or B? Just thinking to yourself, you do not need to put this in the Q&A. Which one would you pick? A says, but even though he was good, everyone was afraid of him. And text B says, Rick and his mom do not see trash. They see the sun and the ducks. Now that you've had a second to think, hopefully everybody's decided A or B. B is obviously the decodable text, and B is the one that I would choose for this child to read. And you might recognize it. There's Rick again from the example I was just giving. I would choose B for a few reasons. The first is that we see a lot of consonant digraphs that this child can start practicing. They can bring those skills into a text that they have just recently been learning in phonics. The second is that without even calculating how decodable this is, without counting every single word as decodable or not, I can tell that the second text has far more decodable words than the first text for a child at this particular stage. And also, of course, we hopefully see that, well, you can't quite see that in this. I will cue you into the fact that in the top text, we see a lot, sorry, let's back up. If we're thinking about text B, we're seeing a lot more decodable words. We're also seeing quite a lot of high frequency words, which we talked about last week, are critical to be able to support children in applying those in context. Now, if we look at text A, we do see some high frequency words to be sure. And we do see some words that maybe a child at this stage could decode, but we see a lot of other things going on. We see several complicated long vowel patterns, and we also see several multisyllabic words. For a child who is reading CVC words and just working on also reading words with consonant digraphs, this is going to be an enormous challenge. And essentially, the only way that you would be able to accurately read that is if you already knew those words from some other context, not because you were really truly decoding them with the knowledge you had learned in phonics. What's strange about this is that both of these texts are recommended for the same moment in first grade as one another, just in two different curriculums. The bottom text is recommended for kind of early middle year in first grade, based on the foundations, phonics, scope, and sequence. And the top text is actually lexiled for the same approximate month as the bottom text, again, for first graders. This helps us understand one really important thing about the texts that are currently available for us to use with our students. All those measures that we're used to, like Fontes and Pinnell, like the Lexile, other systems that put a number or a letter level on a text that tell us a gradient of something, they are not going to be accurately identifying decodable texts. Those measures were not created to be able to identify text with a high proportion of decodable words. So if we're looking for decodable text, we cannot rely on those metrics in order to be able to tell us if a text is going to be decodable or not. We need to actually look at the individual words in the text and how related those are to our scope and sequence or to the children that are in front of us. But one more mythbuster for you around decodable text. And that's that it's not just decodability. Decodability is not the only thing that matters when we're thinking about text for young children. We see that many other things matter when we are trying to support children's long-term reading development and when we're trying to support their accuracy in a given text. This is an example of some of the things that we see in research that are supportive of children beyond just decodability. In research, we often call these multiple criteria text. That means that we're thinking about multiple criteria of a text at once instead of just one. Generally, when we look at the research on decodable text, we see that in the 2010, 2012 area, there was a shift towards researchers talking exclusively about decodable text, and then researchers really talking primarily about multiple criteria texts that included the criteria of decodability. So some of the research on decodable text is actually about multiple criteria texts, where the researchers still were trying to make sure that there was a high proportion of words that were decodable, but also were attending to some of these other things. Things like, are the words familiar and concrete? Can kids really understand these words? Are there some repeated words or word patterns? So why is this important? Well, if you remember all the way back to webinar 1, we talked about how oftentimes we need between 1 to 8 attempts at decoding a word to create an orthographic map and to hold that word in long-term memory. So we do see some benefit of having some repetition of words. That's different than having repetition of whole sentence patterns, because that is not going to support kids in decoding them. We also see having meaningful text is quite critical. Having text with natural language and syntax that match actual English texts and spoken language is also very important for children's fluency development, and especially important for our English learners, because we want to send them messages that English reading is real and that it makes sense. We also see that it can be helpful to have cohesive text sets, so to have decodable texts that are related to content that we're learning in other spaces, or a text set of decodables across a specific time period that can also simultaneously support some aspects of knowledge building. And finally, of course, we want texts that are culturally appropriate and relevant to the children in our classroom, so that at least some of the time, everyone in our room is getting the chance to see themselves represented in these texts. Now, what does it actually sound like to get one of these lessons? Well, if you're already using these texts a lot, you might be using them in your old guided reading style lessons, or you might be using them in your whole class phonics. You might be using them in a whole variety of ways. And we don't have tons and tons of research on the exact lesson plan that would be the best for decodable texts. But one thing that I saw in my own research was that it seems to be helpful to start any sort of lesson around decodable text by reminding children about that phonics skill that they're working on. If kids are about to read a decodable text where 15 out of the 45 words have a digraph in them, consonant digraph, it's really helpful to review those decoding skills, to do some blending and segmenting with that sound, and then do maybe even some word building before we get into the text to get them ready to read those types of words. I also think it's really important to start thinking about how we're prompting readers and thinking about how we're making sure that we are prompting them to decode as well. And of course, you'll see that across these little steps in this simple lesson plan, there is an orientation towards purpose and towards meaning. Even if these texts aren't super meaningful, having a little bit of a nod towards the fact that no matter what we're reading, we are making meaning out of it. Even if the only meaning is, okay, that was silly, or there was a cat in that story with a rat, but knowing that we are always engaged in that meaning making. The final tip, though, is, of course, make sure that we remember that the purpose of these texts is to decode words. So it doesn't make sense to use a lesson plan where kids are not decoding words. For example, if our students are ready to start decoding words with vowel teams, and we are going to give them some decodables with vowel teams that we have studied, it doesn't make a lot of sense to use that for shared reading, oral reading, or echo reading, because in those structures, kids are not actually doing any decoding. They're just parroting and repeating what you've done the work to read. If we want kids to really get the benefit of applying decoding in context, they have to be the ones to decode the words. So we want to make sure that, especially on the first time that kids are reading, if they're ready for that text, they should be the one doing the decoding. And how do we help them do that decoding? Well, of course, we're going to prompt them. When I think about prompting in decodable text, I like to think about it on a scale of supportiveness and specificity, where we might start off not that supportive or specific, saying things like, look at the word, look at the letters, and moving towards a space where we might say something quite supportive and quite specific, like reminding children about something, an orthographic pattern. In this word, remember, S and H together are going to spell the sound sh. Try that word again. So in the resources for today, I've added a decoding prompting guide that can help you start thinking about what kinds of prompts we might use depending on the word and what the student is doing. And you'll see, especially in this third bucket, these unknown decodable words that a child is making an error on, really focusing on thinking about where is the child making this error and what do they need to fix it. So for example, I might try this second one if the child is really having a hard time blending the sounds back together. But I might try the third or fourth if a child is getting a particular spelling wrong and saying the wrong sound for that. Then when we look at the bottom, thinking about those unknown words that aren't decodable, sometimes it might be best to just give students the word. If it's like a really hard word, if it's way beyond their decoding capability, that might be our best bet. Other times it might be better to give them some support in actually decoding through that word. So for example, say it's a CVC word decodable, but the word hot dog is there in the text. Well, we can easily cover up dog and then cover up hot and have children decode those two individual CVC words and then read through that full compound word, which can be a pretty exciting experience for someone in kindergarten or first grade, realizing that they can, with your support, read a pretty big word. So what are the swaps for this? Well, there's two. The first is that if you haven't started yet, thinking about swapping out some predictable text in particular for decodable text. And if you haven't found any text yet that you like, you could go ahead and try out my website, beyonddecodable.com, or you can go to the UFLI resource page, just Google it, and you can find a decodable scope and sequence with a link to many, many different publishers. You can use this even if you don't use their scope and sequence, because they lay out pretty clearly where all of these texts, like from 10 or 15 different publishers, fall on their scope and sequence. And you can use their scope and sequence to kind of think about, okay, well, where is mine? And then look across and see what books you might be able to try out. If you're already teaching with decodables a lot, then I encourage you to start thinking about swapping out your prompts. So swapping from things like saying, check that first letter, to saying things like slide through the sounds, to using that decoding prompting guide that is again on the Padlet to take your decoding up a notch in context. All right. I see a lot of questions. So I am going to go ahead and pause so that we can take a look and make sure we can get some of these answered. Jody asked, when is it appropriate to introduce decodables in a kindergarten classroom? Well, we do have some research that would suggest that when kids know about 13 to 15 letters and they are able to do some phonemic blending, we should be asking them to read and write words at least by then. So if we're thinking about it that way, we might start out with some simple words or some simple sentences. And certainly the children should start really working with decodable text, I would say probably before winter break, but absolutely by January, we should be working with some basic CVC texts. Then we have another question about sometimes kids can decode it, but they might not understand the words because they might need some vocabulary. Absolutely, great point. Sometimes decodable words are weird. If we have a weird word or a word that is not appropriate for our age group, sorry, I don't mean inappropriate. I mean that they wouldn't know it from their own experiences at 5 years old, then making sure that we include some vocabulary instruction is key. Should decodable books be used exclusively with very low readers instead of level A to E texts? At this time, the research on decodable text is around developing decoders. So those are children generally in grades K through 2 who are still really reading sound by sound or sometimes chunk by chunk, but not children who sound fluent in grade level texts. We can use that same schema to think about older readers who still need that kind of support. But right now, we think that using a lot of decodable text for this age group and development group is really helpful. That being said, we should never only expose children to decodable text. So we should make sure that kids are getting a lot of exposure to more complex text through things like shared reading, read aloud, science lessons, social studies lessons, listening to books on epic, reading at home, all these other experiences where they can be around rich, complex texts. All right. Okay. Yes, I did say don't use decodable text for choral reading. That is in the sense that you shouldn't use that first. So if you're using a decodable and the first thing that you do is you say to your whole class, repeat after me, then no one in your classroom is decoding any words. Your children are repeating after you as you directed them. If what you're doing is you're first teaching children to read the text, and then maybe you're doing a small group where kids are doing a decodable text lesson, and then 2 kids go off and they're reading it together, that is different. That is a totally appropriate way that we might use them. All right, we're gonna keep going because we do have some other content to cover. All right, so this is gonna be quick. We're not gonna do a deep dive on spelling or on independent reading, but I wanted to offer you some things to think about. So quick poll, true or false, only reading practice supports reading development. All right, we're gonna go ahead and end the poll just for the sake of time. So most folks thinking false, but we got some true, some not sure. So, well, is this true or false? It is absolutely false. Reading is not the only thing that helps readers grow. In particular, spelling is something that we know can support our readers. First, we know that spelling is a part of this. Spelling is a whole part of this decoding journey, of children's reading journey. Bidirectional practice is super great. So this idea that we both need to read and spell, the practice in both directions, is really important. And we do know that spelling is the use of the code. And so we need to include that as part of our practices. We also see some interesting studies that indicate to us that sometimes spelling might actually even be better than reading for reading development, which is pretty wild to think about. We have some studies that indicate that emphasizing spelling practice over reading practice sometimes may actually lead to improved reading outcomes and improved orthographic learning, and might definitely benefit children with dyslexia. So we don't need to stop reading and tell kids they can only spell, but we certainly need to make sure that we are including enough spelling in our day to support children in, yes, their spelling, but also their reading. And we can support spelling to support reading in a lot of different ways. We can do this in phonics. The word building example from last week and some of the later examples you can see if you stay for Read, Write, Roar are really things that we do in phonics a lot. And that's definitely one way that we can support spelling. The other thing we can do is, of course, anytime children are writing, we can support spelling. And this can include small group time that's dedicated to writing, where we are going to really foreground children's spelling and other foundational skills. And we might use strategies like interactive writing. And if you're not familiar with that, there are some really good YouTube videos of interactive writing if you want to do a Google afterwards. But I want to just give you, again, this is not a deep dive. This is a very surface level conversation about spelling, but I want to give you a couple ways to think about how you can support spelling while kids are writing. So I'm going to give you a little encoding prompting guide. So this is not out of the book. This is kind of separate and in addition to the book. Along with the decoding prompting guide, this one's on the Padlet. And it is a way that you can start thinking about how you can support your spellers whenever they are reading. And this is actually drawn and inspired by a meta-analysis by some researchers not that many years ago. And they were specifically looking at spelling interventions that supported children with or at risk of dyslexia. So if we know that these are supportive of children in that population who might need a lot of extra support in spelling, then they are likely to support all of our spellers. And before I move on, I do want to quickly note, encoding is the opposite of decoding. So spelling isn't always necessarily encoding. If I asked you right now to spell the word chat, everybody in this room knows how to spell the word chat without thinking about it. You're not really going through the act of actually matching individual phonemes and graphemes. That's the same as you're not decoding the word chat. You know it automatically on site. So encoding, just like decoding, is an act of really matching those individual phonemes and graphemes, or sometimes larger parts, like knowing a prefix or a suffix and being able to actually produce them by writing, or in some cases by choosing the letter tiles or keyboarding as well. So some things that we can say to children to help them write more accurately, or spell more accurately rather. First, if a child doesn't know how to start, we can always help them by actually supporting them in breaking the sounds down. What word, this is the word cat that you wanted to write right here. What word? Cat. What's the first sound? Okay, write it and let's keep going. If a child is missing sounds in words, we can again point to it and say, you were trying to spell the word black, but watch my finger. I'm going to go across each of these letters. You have spelled back. What sound's missing? What letter spells that sound? Where can we put that to make sure that we have spelled this through? And I have gone so far as to, after that point, if a child puts an L at the end of the word, then I have blended through that to black, ooh. It's hard to even say, but showing children exactly where your eyes go and where your finger is going and what word that results in can help them actually fix their writing on their own. 3, student spells a sound with one possible spelling, but not the conventional one. We absolutely want to celebrate invented and estimated spelling, but we also do want to support children in knowing the conventions of spelling. This isn't always going to be your end goal. For example, a kindergartner who really wants to spell the word champion, maybe you're not going to get them all the way there, but if it's appropriate, we can absolutely help kids in getting to that conventional spelling by actually giving them some real information about that spelling. For example, if we see children missing that CK at the end of a word where it's and they're just putting a C, for example, oftentimes that's not going to be how we spell the sound at the end of words. So we can explain that spelling convention to them. And finally, if they have made an error in a known affix, we can help them by reminding them how we spell that particular prefix or suffix. I also just wanted to include a brief and incomplete example of some of the spelling conventions that we have in English. If you aren't feeling super knowledgeable about this topic, That is really okay. We can all continue to learn more about spelling conventions because there are a lot and some of them are really complicated. But this is just one table with some examples of spelling conventions that we may or may not already know that we can use to support children in getting towards those conventions by actually bringing them explicitly to children to make sure that they know how to spell words conventionally. So what is the swap for this? Well, it's to stop thinking about only reading, helping reading, and thinking about how scaffolding spelling can help our readers. Tomorrow, if children are writing, try thinking about how you're supporting children's spelling and more than just spelling a word for them that they are wondering what the conventional spelling is. And we can use this in any setting, but if you haven't tended to do this kind of scaffolding, I would suggest starting with a smaller group or one-on-one until you get the hang of it. All right, and now quickly for our last part, and then we're going to hear a little bit more from Annie. Our third topic today, independent reading. And our poll is, how much time do your students spend in independent reading per day? Just estimate. Do we have the poll? Let's see. There we go. So your options are 0 minutes, up to 15 minutes, 16 to 30, or over 30 minutes. All right, let's go ahead and end this poll. Okay, so most of us are spending about 15 to 30 minutes with children doing some independent reading. All right, so something surprising that may be hard to think about is that we actually have a recent meta-analysis, which is a study of many, many studies. Many students, over 10,000 children were participants in these various studies that found no meaningful benefit to sustained, silent, unsupported independent reading time for K-12, which is a really shocking finding for many of us. Please know, this study is not suggesting kids shouldn't have time to read. Instead, this study is reminding us that giving kids the task of independent reading, if we are not providing any additional support, is not necessarily doing what we think it's doing. This is for a couple reasons, but one major reason might be if a child is not interested in reading and we say, everybody go read, and we don't give them any additional structure to that experience, that child is probably the least likely to actually be reading and to derive any benefit from that experience. But that child is probably the most likely to need to benefit from that experience because they probably really need additional support and time in text so that they become a better reader. So this study to me points us to the fact that we need to think about how we can be certain to support independent reading time to make sure that it's beneficial for all students, not just the students who are likely to be ready to read at any time of day. So here are a few things from research that we see are ways that we can make sure children are supported in their independent reading. The first is actually going back to our first topic, which is giving children decodable texts for those developing decoders to read independently. They don't necessarily have to be ones that they have already read with you, but sometimes they could be. But we see that for developing decoders, having the chance to independently read decodable text is supportive of their reading development. Second, we can give them a partner and we can give them some known text that they can do a little bit of rereading on. If we are asking children, though, to reread text, we probably want to stick about 4 times of rereading and then making sure that they're getting another different experience. We see in research on repeated reading that after we do about 4 repeats, we are getting no added benefit. So thinking carefully about making sure that kids have other activities that they can do, not just rereading the same text on and on and on. We can also use structures like book clubs. This is more common in the upper grades, but we can bring them into the lower grades to a certain extent, where children are engaged in reading a text and discussing a text together and are able to feel the support from that experience. We also know that providing a clear purpose for a reading activity is very supportive of children. For example, linking it to content learning. Instead of having, okay, you can read anything that you want, sometimes we might want to instead say, okay, today everybody is going to pick a text about an animal, and I have laid out options for you to select from. And everyone's going to read a nonfiction informational text about animals. And then later today in science, when we're studying some animal features, you're going to bring at least one fact from the text that you read today to share with the class so that we can all learn a little bit more about animals. So thinking about ways that we can give kids clarity in their purpose for reading that is beyond just reading, because as we know, not every child is necessarily going to be motivated by that particular experience. We can also try adding ebooks with supportive features. So that would be features like highlighting the words as they go, or helping them read a word that they don't know, although I'm not sure that there's a lot of technology that's able to do that, or telling them a word, or even just reading the whole text to them. We also have a sort of adorable study where researchers tried giving children dogs to read to. They didn't see a huge meaningful benefit, but the kids did enjoy it. So if you're an after-school program, or you're at home with a student, or not a student, a child that is your, you're a caregiver of, you might think about having them read to your pup. And then, of course, changing our expectations. Being careful about thinking about how much we're asking kids to engage in independent reading and what their developmental level of reading is. For example, a kindergartner who can't read CVC words yet should not be spending 40 minutes expected to read independently. The chance that that child is reading independently, if they can't read 3-letter words, is basically zero. And the chance that they engage in a storytelling with themselves or their partner around the pictures in a text, that might happen some, but it's unlikely that it would last 40 whole minutes. So we need to be careful about thinking about how long we're asking kids to sustain this kind of experience, and if it's appropriate for their particular developmental stage. So what's the swap for this? Well, trying to think about what are ways that we can support independent reading. Is there something I could add to this time in my classroom's day to make sure that everybody is supported as they read independently? So in our final moments, just reminding you of today's takeaways. First, thinking about trying out some decodable text for developing decoders. Second, thinking about prompting spelling with just as much care as we prompt decoding. And finally, finding ways to support independent reading time. Across our sessions together, we also have some takeaways, and these are kind of going from stage 1 to stage 4 in terms of where you might be at in your journey. If you're thinking, where should I go from here? First, if you haven't read the rest of the book, go ahead and find some time over the summer where you can really read and think about the book. If you have read the book, if you've engaged with everything that we're doing here, but you haven't quite tried something out yet, try one thing before summer. And it can be a small thing. It can be to say, for example, from today, I'm going to bring that encoding prompting guide with me to my writing groups tomorrow during my writing lesson. And I'm going to make sure that I'm prompting kids to encode and to spell with just as much care as I prompt kids to decode when we're reading. If you have already been making a lot of swaps and you're really into it and you're having an awesome time engaging in all of this, you can see if you and your ISD coach can join us in the fall. We have a really small number of openings for that particular experience that Annie is going to speak to. But if you're really into it, please do reach out to your ISD coach. And finally, if you're making a lot of strides and you're changing all sorts of things and you've read this book and you've read other books and you are ready for the next thing, I would encourage you to start thinking about how you could collaborate and build community around some strategic change within your school, within your district, if online, if you need to, but ideally at home and around the people near you so that you can really help support everybody in joining us in these different types of changes. So remember, what are we going to do after all of this? We're going to change instruction so that we're focusing on teaching decoding on purpose. And we're leveraging real research findings to know how to do this best. But we're simultaneously going to make sure we still see that forest. We are going to make sure that as we do this, we do not forget that reading is a lot more than decoding, and that these skills are a means to an end, that we are driven and called to teach as effectively and efficiently as possible so that we have more time and energy to support all of these other aspects of reading that we know are absolutely critical for children's long-term success. So I'll close with, if you try something, tell me about it. There's one person who's joined us for these webinars who's been Instagram messaging me, and I can't tell you how happy that makes me. If you think you're bothering me, you are absolutely not. I would love to hear from you. So if that's the kind of place that you like to engage, feel free to reach out, and otherwise feel free to email or whatever you are able to do. Unfortunately, we're not going to get to all of the Q&As because Annie does have some important messages to share with you. So if you have some questions left, please take them to the Padlet, where I will be sure that to go back in and answer the questions as they come. If you put a question on the Padlet recently, I just didn't have a chance to answer them just yet, but I will be answering them soon. Annie, I'm going to throw it back to you.
Thank you so much, Julia. I know that you all probably took so much out of this, and it's really exciting to know, thank you, that we can keep these available until the end of June so people can go back and rewatch. As I'm sharing some things, I'm going to just launch a poll as I'm sharing some resources to just see where everyone is. So I'd love to know about your experience with a literacy coach in Michigan. So as you're answering that, I will just be screen sharing and going over our last few things that we have here in the last few minutes. Let's see. Are you seeing my screen right now? Because it's not showing. Can you see this screen where it says resources to support further learning?
Yes, we can see it.
Thank you. Perfect. Because it is not doing what it usually does. Okay, so we have a lot of things that we want to share with you. One is just a reminder about the modules. They're free. They're there for you. I'm going to give you a little glimpse of Essential 6. This is an example of what we have for the Essential 6 module. It's 131 minutes of content. That includes, of course, is an introduction, but there's a 7-minute presentation at the beginning, which includes a video of interactive writing being modeled in a pre-K classroom. And then Dr. Schutz has a 25-minute video on interactive writing that she models as well with students in a small group setting. So take advantage of Essential 6 if you have not done that before. There's several other bullets, but within all of this work, there's 4 classroom videos. You'll have stop and ponder questions and discussion questions. So whether or not your whole school needs to focus on writing, the modules are a great place for you to start and be able to do that. I also wanted to include for you a little kind of cheat sheet and guidance on interactive writing that I made, and you are welcome to use that. There's a link right in my slides to the document, and then within that link there's a optional fillable planning template for you that gives you just some overviews of some of the research on interactive writing. So there's that. I also wanted to let you know that we have a guidance document here about the modules. It tells you what piece of a literacy construct is covered within each module. And you'll notice there's green check marks. That means that essential module is the main module. So for Essential 4, when we're speaking of phonological awareness, that is in green, but all these other places mention and talk about phonological awareness. So that link to that full document's there for you as well. And we have a whole page where Dr. Duke and Dr. Wright have some videos that are freely accessible for you. Dr. Duke did this modeling with us as coaches that we could share about small group instruction, but those are freely available, and that's the link there. And it includes a lot of some of the great things we've talked about here, just another way to get some more insight on that. And also listening to reading, writing while watching protocol that's in Dr. Lindsey's book. There's a whole page on Dr. Duke's website, which is a treasure trove of information, but this is one page that's on that website. So I just encourage you and invite you to go to that. And then I'm going to share our results so we can see what we have going on here for who we are. So we have a lot of people that either are a coach or are working with a coach, but we had 30 of you that this was not applicable. So that tells me that you don't have any coach support. And we do want, that's important information for us to have as we think about ways that we can support you going forward. One of the things that I did want to make sure you have, it was buried inside of a handout last week, but Dr. Duke did go through each letter of the alphabet and how it's pronounced. So that's available for you. And that link is here for you as well. Don't forget to check out literacyessentials.org, bookmark this page. And here's an example. Events are posted on the site. And here's an example of the things that are on the event page right now, some of which you are in at this moment. And Dr. Lindsey talked about her Beyond Decodables. There's a link for that here for you. And also there's a book list for Read, Write, Roar, which will show you when we used a Beyond Decodable in one of the Read, Write, Roar lessons. So you'll have this full book list available to you as well. Keep looking into the Padlet. Books are continuing to be sent, and the Padlet is still alive and well, as Dr. Lindsey said, so keep adding things there. And here's just some ideas about ways to keep engaging, including what Dr. Lindsey said, there will be an option for ISD coaches to be working in a small group cohort with teachers. We're going to be supporting coaches to implement some of the practices in the book this fall. So if you are interested in that, I would recommend that you, when you fill out the feedback form that we have for you, that you go in there when it says ISD, find your ISD. If you go to the ISD that you're a part of, if you didn't know who your ISD coach is, you'll be able to find out who that person is and go to their website so that you'd be able to participate, or at least get information that you want to participate, because we're going to see how we can do this. And if there's a lot of interest, what that looks like for us. So I'm going to post that in the chat for you, the feedback form, but I also wanted to let you know that please do keep in touch with me too. I've never shared this part out. You have my email, certainly, but other places you can find me. I try to be on Twitter as much as I can. I'm not as great at that as I'd like to be, but there's your feedback form, and keep in touch. And for those of you staying on, we'll be happy to be launching in to our Read, Write, Roar content right now. And I'm so excited. So you'll be getting sketches. Okay, so someone in the Q&A said, where do I see sketch information? When you fill out the feedback form, that is when you put in your number for your sketches. You will not have received any information up until now about anything from MDE, because we submit everything today. This is the last webinar. It's a series. And so we'll be submitting everything at one time. So if you did not fill out a form for each of the webinars that we've been in, please do that, and make sure that you do that if you want sketches. So that form is linked for you. I hope that answers your question about how you do it. And for those of you who are here, I'm going to launch this about who thinks they are interested in receiving coaching around implementing the different resources that are in Dr. Lindsey's book. This will just be helpful for me to know what kind of interest we have, and help me to realize how we can support people where you are. And now we're going to launch into some talk about Read, Write, Roar. And I will try and keep up with the Q&A, but I know that I probably won't be as good at that right now. Again, the last word, someone asked about that. Comprehension is the word that you need in order to be able to access the all of the work that is in the Scholastic page. And that's also linked in the learner guide for you. So we are going to look at a couple of different lessons today that would be able to support the work that we've been talking about with Dr. Lindsey regarding Essential 4, with segmenting, blending, but also in context. And so we're going to talk about that right now. And so I've picked out a few lessons to share with you today. We have 3 different types of lessons that you can find on Read, Write, Roar that we'll look at. The first one is going to be mystery word. And for those of you, we'll talk a little more in depth, but it's similar to making words or building words. And so we're going to look at a first grade version of that and a third grade version of that. We'll also look at what a word ladder might look like for those of you who are participating and doing word ladders and older grades. And also we're going to look at let's sort. And we've talked about sorting a little bit. And unfortunately, we find that sorting can be done really well, but unless we're really having it be a loud time of day when we're doing a lot of the things that Dr. Lindsey's been supporting us to learn and think about, then it's not really going to be effective. If kids are just looking at words and sorting them by pattern, they're not actually going through any of the things we've talked about in our webinar series, where they're really having to do phoneme segmentation and blending and be thinking about the phonemic, that smallest unit of sound within words. So we're going to talk about that, and I'm ending the poll, but appreciate your feedback. I don't think I need to share that one because that's for us, but I appreciate you said that, and I'll be looking at those results later on today. Thank you. Liberty had posted in the chat the feedback form. I'm going to post that one more time in case you did not see that. So you can give your feedback to us, and we do read those. So let's take a look at within each of these lessons, there's different skills that are discussed within those. And I showed one of these before. This gives an example of the types of skills that are within the lesson types that we talk about. I specifically pulled out word letters and mystery words for this one, and then connected it to where you'd find this in the essential instructional practices. That's what EIP stands for. So this would be essential instructional practice 4, bullet 3, talking about segmenting in segmenting sounds. And then this here under the Michigan ELA standards, this would, RF is reading foundational skill, kindergarten would be the K, 1 would be the first strand, and D would be the sub strand underneath that strand. So we just wanted you to know that we did work hard to try and connect these, but I'm also going to tell you that you might look at these and say, I'm still going to need to tweak this part. And that's all. We do encourage you to think about that. What is it that you know? What resources are you using in your school? But we just want to offer this as one way that you might be able to engage in some additional learning in your classroom, or have some examples to look at when you are trying to do some practice like in context with kids. So again, we're going to be connecting to Essential 4, Essential 5, and thinking about Essential 6, specifically in these children are doing writing. So they're doing that mapping, the phoneme mapping, they're attaching it to the graphemes with the letter sounds they know, and then they are writing the words. So the first lesson we're going to talk about is mystery word. And so when we think about preparing for a mystery word, there are many steps that have to be gone through. Okay, so we have to select the words that you're going to use within the lesson, and these should reflect the phonics skills and letter sound relationships that you're currently teaching to your students. So if you're doing digraphs, they would have digraphs. If you're doing R control vowels, they would have that. You want to consider the content area you're teaching. And so, for example, this one here, you see camouflage. We were working on a unit to do an informational text project. Kids were reading about different organisms. They were thinking about how adult animals and their offspring differ from one another. And I did a modeled unit on frogs. And so one of the things we talked about was camouflage. And that came up in a lot of animal books that we had read. So that is why the word camouflage is there, even though that would be a pretty high level first grade word. And I acknowledge that in the lesson for the kids. So as you think about mystery word lessons, think about a content area that you're studying and how you might be able to connect that, but also be thinking about a content area word that also has the different phonics features that you've been teaching to kids. So you'll gather together, you have to have all the letter cards, and we have a handout for you for that. You'll need to know what type of letters amount of letters you're focusing on in the words you're going to make. This one, I was focusing on 2-letter words, 4-letter words, and 5-letter words. You also want to be making sure that you put them in a sequence for when you're going to teach the words. For example, you might have kids make the 2-letter word am, am. And then you might say, now we're going to add 2 letters to change the word am into the word came. And you would segment that came, and then map on the letter sounds and talk about the final E that's there to make the A say the A sound. From there, you might go from came into flame, because we know we just have to change the initial sound for that for kids. Depending on the kids you have, you may change it up into a different way. But that's going to be important, that as you are planning this, you're really, really thoughtful about how you make the words, how you group the words together, and how you're trying to connect this all back for the kids. And I used to use this in first grade all the time when I was teaching first grade, and kids loved it. And then I would send it home after we'd done it a lot in school. They did it with their families, and their families loved to engage in this of the mystery word. And it was always linked to our curriculum. So Once they've gotten the routine of it and it's something you think that they could just have for fun for practice, kids really did end up loving it. But again, what we're talking about here today is going to be the explicit instruction part, not just the part they're doing on their own. So I wanted to give you an example here. Again, there's letter cards that are free to download, and we have those available for you. And here's an example of what I do to prep for this. For the word came, on the back of the index card came, I would make sure that I knew how many sounds were in that word, how many letters are in that word, and how I was going to explain that to the kids. And so I go through that for every single word that I'm making. The beauty of this is that once you do this once, then you have this whole card set that you can do this mystery word again. And maybe you have some colleagues at the grade level and you can share some of this work. If you know that you have certain ones coming up, you could each make one and share it across your grade level. I love my grade level team and I don't know what I would have done without them. So be thinking about, even if it feels like a lot to implement up front, there are ways that you can make this a little bit easier for you. The links again to the letter card, the link to letter cards is right in the learner guide for you today that you have for our session. So you'll be able to get to that really easily. And I wanted to just show an example of how, for the camouflage lesson, how this is mapped onto my thoughts about how this lesson relates to what we're doing. This one for camouflage, as I said, was a first grade lesson. It was geared toward the end of the school year. And it's geared toward doing, I had to do a lot of scaffolding in this lesson that if you watch the whole thing later, you'll see I didn't do a ton of scaffolding up front because we had done other ones before, but I did scaffold for the word camouflage because that's a very difficult word. And I did also make note of the word camo being like a slang word, but people use it and write it all the time. So that's why I had that in here. We wanted to show that this connects, supports children to connect the new to the known. For example, once we've spelled the word full, then we help the kids to spell the word goal. So that was something that we did. We wanted to provide some application and review for the long U letter patterns that we had done, like UE and UME. So I was pretty strategic in the words I chose to make out of the word camouflage. And again, it was connected to our science unit that we were working on. So this is just to illustrate how this all connects together. The lesson we're going to dig in and watch today as a group is going to be a piece from Mrs. Mora, who's a no, she's not, a third grade teacher on Read Write Roar doing a mystery word. So I'm going to open that up so that we can take a peek at what Miss Mora did for that. Okay, I did open up a whole window for this. So we're going to skip over mine and go right to Miss Mora's. Here we go.
On your paper, I'd like you to write down the sounds that you hear in the word blue. All right, let's look at this word together. When I hear the word blue, I hear that the beginning sound of this word has changed. Instead of the F, now I hear a B, B. And this B is blending with the oo to say boo, ooh. Now there's one more letter that this word needs. In the word flu, we had a U at the end, but in the word blue, there's actually another vowel. Maybe you already know how to spell the word blue. Did you add an E to the end of this word? This is how we spell the word blue. You might be wondering why. Because flu has the same sound at the end, but it only has a U. And blue has the oo sound, but it's a U and an E. That's because most words in English do not end with the letter U. There are a few that do end with the letter U. Flu does, for example, because it comes from a longer word, influenza. But usually if you hear the oo or the long U sound at the end of a word, there might be a silent E at the end so that the U is not at the end of the word. There could be a different spelling pattern too. Let's put blue under the word flu. Now, you're going to change the beginning blend of this word from blue to make the word true. Like, is that true? Did it really happen? True. Now, When I look at this word, I also hear a blend, but this blend is written with different letters. On your paper, write down the letters that match the sounds you hear in this word. At the beginning of the word true, instead of the blend, I hear true. I know that's spelled with first the t and then the letter R. True. Do you see how again in this word we have the silent E at the end? That's because most English words don't have U at the end. Sometimes we add an E so that these words don't end in a U.
I'm going to pause that right here because what I want you to note, so this is third grade, right? So I'm going to show you a little clip of me doing it with first grade so you can see the ways that we're doing some phoneme segmentation and matching.
Now we're going to do something fun. We're going to change full into goal. If you play soccer, you might try and score a goal. Good. Oh, ooh. What letter are we going to change? Yes, the first letter, F. We're going to change out and put a G there instead. Good. Oh, ooh. Good. Oh, ooh. Goal. G-O-A-L. Can you write goal now? Isn't it fun to see? If you can spell goal, you can spell goal. I'm going to add goal down here. Our next word is clue. Ooh, ooh. There's 3 sounds, but there's 4 letters. Ooh. Yes, that's letter C and letter L. Now, with the vowels we have left, how would we make the ooh sound? What patterns have you been working on for that? You got it. U and E can make the ooh sound. C-L-U-E spells clue. I will tell you a clue for the mystery word today is, again, it's related to our topic. We talked about it with frogs. It's something they use for protection. There's another clue. Okay, I want you to now take clue and change it into glue. What would we have to do? Ooh, ooh. 3 sounds, 4 letters. You've got it. If you can spell glue, then you can spell glue.
So hopefully you can see how this lesson in first grade is a lot more highly scaffolded than the one that's in third grade. So let's say you have a student that needs to do some of this work. Well, you may want to take a peek at some of the first grade lessons to have them practice on their segmenting and blending before looking at the older grades. And then they kind of graduate up to the ones where they don't have that same amount of scaffolding, where I'm doing it with them and I'm modeling the segmentation and blending. So just wanted to give you that as an example. And now we're going to take a look at, where are we here? Just have you think about these questions. Is how might you see this connected to your instruction? Did you notice any new practices that you might implement? And also where you might be able to, if you have any questions about these practices, please put those in the Q&A or shoot me an email. I am seeing things in the Q&A about the sketch forms. Those were sent out at the end of the webinars. Everything is being put in the Padlets. I'll even repost those. I think just if people didn't know where to find them, I will put them in the Padlet. The Padlet is where all the video recordings are. So the sign out and feedback form, I know I put that in the Padlet for session 3. If you need to find that. Okay, so what we want to make sure you have is something you can use going forward. So you're going to have a link not only to the alphabet cards, that if you wanted to make your own mystery word lessons, these cards that you print out are the same ones I used on my pocket chart. There's also this that you could have kids cut these out so that they could have their own letters. And then here's a form. This is just like the one I used to use 20 something years ago in first grade for kids, where they would be making their own words and writing them down. That is something that I definitely had us do, even though not all building words, making words lessons do that. I wanted to make sure students did write down the words after they made them. So those resources are on my slide deck. When you open up my slide deck in the learner guide, anything that says link will be live. So you just click on it and you can make a copy and it will open up for you so that now you'll have your own copy of the form that I just shared for you. It's taken a little long, but there you go. So that way, if you want to make your own form to have specific letters that you're focused on, you can just go for that and do your own one. So let's get back here and move along to think about our word ladder. We are going to be looking, we did do a lot of word ladders last time and showed some examples. Today, I wanted to show you an example that's coming from, whoops, not this one, coming from our second grade teacher, Mrs. Zari King. And we talked last time about word ladders. You start at the bottom, work your way up. You're doing segmenting and blending of sounds. You're doing phoneme deletion, phoneme insertion, like phoneme swapping within these. And for this one, they're working on a higher level skill with different patterns. So I wanted to let you see that there can be a variation in word ladders. The one we looked at before, we had a kindergarten and a first grade example. So here's a second grade example for you to just have a sneak peek at that.
Hello, scholars. I'm Mrs. ZK, and today we are going to create a word ladder. Yeah, we're going to start right here at the bottom of our ladder, and we are going to go up and up until we get to the top. As we go up, we are going to be changing part of our word to make a whole new word. Our words will be using the vowel, consonant, consonant, vowel pattern, where the syllables are split between the two consonants. That'll help you later. All right, scholars, hopefully you have your paper and something to write with ready, and we're going to get started. So scholars, our first word is at your house. You might have a brother or a sister. Nice job. So we're going to split that word into two syllables. Sister. Okay, what sounds do you hear in sis? Is. Write it. And what about ter? Ooh, do you remember how to make the sound? Here's our first word, sister. Check it and see how you did. Nice work, scholars. All right, so here's the part where we change part of the word to make a new word. This word is the opposite of summer. What word is it? Winter. Nice job. Okay, so split that word up into its syllables. We have winter. Did you notice that the second syllable is the same as the first word that we wrote? Nice. So we're only changing the first syllable. Well, what sounds do you hear in win? Well, well, go ahead and write it. We have winter. And together they make the word winter. And then you can go ahead and check your word here on the ladder. All right, scholars, we're going to change it up again. This word is the opposite of before. What word would you use to describe the opposite of before? After. Nice work. Break it up into its syllables. We have after. Ter being the same. So what sounds do you hear in act? Just two. Go ahead and write it. So you should have after. And then together it makes the word after. Nice work, scholars. All right, switching the word again. This word is a word used to describe little animals like mice. Critter. All right, let's put that word up. We got crit, ter. Ter being the same. So what sounds do you hear in crit? It. Oh, I heard a blend at the beginning. Go ahead and write it. So you should have crit, ter. Critter. Yes, and that blend was that CR, cur. Nice work. Go ahead and check your spelling. See if you did that right. Remember that second syllable, that ter is staying the same. All right, let's climb another stair. This word is a word used to describe a section in a book that you might read. A chapter. Okay, let's flip that word into its syllables. We have chapter.
So I thought that example by Miss ZK, I love how she calls herself that, might be helpful for you as well. And the last one that I wanted to show you was a let's sort lesson example. And so this is when we talk about how can word sorting be effective. It's not done quietly, and it's not done by just giving kids a list of words that they need to figure out. So for this lesson I'm doing, I created this anchor chart so it was visual and the kids knew we would go through this. Again, I don't have them in front of me, but the kids watching the show or teachers watching the show, hopefully this was helpful as a guide. The students were applying what they had just been taught in mini lessons because we were trying to loop back to our work that we had done. And I had already gone over anchor words. That's what I call them, the words that like hold us in place that we compare to. And we had the words brim, crib, and prop. And I modeled that and had like a hat as a prop on and used the brim of the hat to show them what a brim was. Again, there were pictures to associate. You can see that there's like props and the word prop, there's a brim and the word brim. And then we have this. So this is a loud time of day. And we're going to look at what that might look like and how you might be using this. Something I discovered when I was doing coaching in schools, and I had second grade teachers come and tell me they had kids that were really having a hard time spelling. Oftentimes these kids had holes in their phonological awareness development, specifically phonemic awareness. And so doing things like arm tapping with them and having them pay attention to the sound they heard in the middle, for some kids that was really hard. And so sometimes if you're doing a sort, even if it's upper grade kids, sometimes a sound sort first with kids without letting them look at the word is something that you could try, because they have to leverage listening to know where they should put the word that you're sorting. This of course is the first grade lesson. And so it's, age appropriate first grade, but there might be some older kids that need this type of really specific work.
Yes, brim. Let's check it. Do they look right?
Oh, sorry, this went further than it was supposed to. I think we're supposed to be. You can see my brimmed hat.
Reading and writing, you'll have those and they'll come fast for you. Okay, so here's how we're going to do this. I'll say the word, okay? I'll say a word, like for instance, the word prim. When something is prim, it's just right and it's proper, prim. And then you will say the word with me. Let's say prim. Great. Then I will say each sound slowly. Prim. Your turn. Because it says you will say each sound slowly. Prim. Well done. Then I will ask, should it go under brim, crib, or prop? Let's try this one. Prim. Prim, brim, prim, crib, prim, prop. Now remember, I'm paying attention to the blend at the beginning. I want to find the word where prim goes, where it will look right at the beginning and sound right, like a purr. So you think prim should go under prop. Let's check it. Does it look right? PR. Now let's see if it sounds right. Prop, prim. Do they both say purr? Yes, they do. Okay, so that one is right. Great job, everybody.
In the interest of time, I'm not going to keep you and show you the rest of the lesson, but it is certainly linked in the learner guide for you. So thank you for staying on with us. Thank you for being here with us. There is a feedback form for you. I'm going to put that in the chat again. It's been a great pleasure to be able to be in this space with all of you. Again, my deepest appreciation for all of you with everything that you're doing. And I hope that you have a wonderful rest of your day and keep in touch. And we will have this recorded for you and I will post it in the chat. And I will put up again ways to keep in touch if you didn't get that earlier. Let's see. here's ways to keep in touch with me. And I sure hope that you will keep in touch with Julia and with me. And we hope that this has been valuable to you. And thank you for everything you're doing for the children that you serve where you are. Have a great rest of your night, and we'll be in touch.